Welcome to the Kyle Olson Show. Our top law enforcement officer in Michigan, Attorney General Dana Nessel, revealed this week that one time her son was, quote, devastated when someone wished him a Merry Christmas at a store. Dana Nessel actually posted that on social media publicly for all the world to see. Let me ask you this. If you're a Christian and you go to a store and someone wishes you Happy Hanukkah, do you get offended? Maybe it's just me, but I say, okay, thanks. And I move on with my life. Not Dana Nessel, apparently. Being wished a Merry Christmas really burned her up and stuck with her all this time later. Nessel took time out of her busy day to respond to something President Trump said at a rally in Georgia. Remember when one of his campaign themes was that he was going to bring back saying Merry Christmas? It was his example of the culture war that continues to play out across America. So he brought that up again the other day. She wrote in response, quote, I remember the first time I was at a store with my son and an employee said, Merry Christmas to us. My son looked devastated and asked, are we the only people who don't celebrate Christmas? I answered, no, and we are just as American as everyone else. Glad Joe Biden knows that. Imagine being that emotionally fragile that is a real conversation for you. And I'm not talking about the kid, who she brought up, by the way. I'm talking about Dana Nessel, the adult. And now think about this is the person who is supposed to be staring down lawbreakers and evildoers in the state. Nessel wasn't done. She followed up, quote, saying happy holidays this time of year does not denigrate Christianity. It simply acknowledges and respects the great diversity of our nation and includes each and every one of us who call ourselves proud Americans. And you know what? Tolerating people saying Merry Christmas respects the traditions of our nation too. By the way, do you really think Dana Nessel considers herself a proud American? If leftists are so proud of America, why are they relentlessly tearing down our institutions, our economic system, our traditions? If you're proud of something, why do you want to fundamentally transform it? Governor Whitmer issued an extension this week to her pause on many aspects of her lives. That came as a surprise to no one. God forbid she releases a little bit of freedom and we can choose to sit in a restaurant. I went to the store the other day and it was packed. I mean, packed. Within my sight line, I could probably see 150 people. So that's okay. But sitting at tables in a restaurant 6 feet apart? No. Why? Science. Science, of course. Here's the governor on Monday.
And we've got to all do our part to protect one another until we eliminate COVID-19 once and for all.
So we've gone from we need 15 days to flatten the curve, that was 10 months ago, to this ambiguous statement, we all need to do our part until we eliminate COVID-19 once and for all. So now it needs to be eliminated? And is that even possible? Has a single reporter in Lansing asked the governor, what science are you following? Will you share it with us? How about some transparency? Or are they more interested in getting their invitation to the governor's holiday party? Governor Whitmer was asked about high school sports resuming, and here's how she and Health and Human Services Director Robert Gordon answered.
As a parent of a high schooler, I believe, and as the governor of Michigan, I believe, that our first priority should be getting students back in the classroom safely. That, I believe, is paramount. But I will hand it over to Director Gordon to talk a little bit more about how that re-engagement might look.
Yeah, just to add to what the governor said, the first priority is reopening high schools for education and sustaining that. I think when it comes to sports, there's a range of risk levels. And so at one end, you have kids, individual activities that are outdoors and where people are spaced out. At another level, you have contact sports outdoors. At another level, you have indoor contact sports. And as you go through those levels, the level of risk increases, and we have to think carefully about moving through them. So I will just leave it where the governor did, that our first priority, and also lower risk than a lot of those activities, is getting the schools open for education.
Did that give you any assurance at all that she has any idea how to get kids back in schools? During the campaign, she was hammering on President Trump for not having a federal strategy. She wanted him to figure out how to get kids in schools. It seems like that's her job because the needs of Michigan are very different from South Dakota or wherever else around the country. So instead of doing that, Governor Whitmer is now co-chair of Joe Biden's inaugural committee, the only governor to be chosen for that. Joining me now to discuss that is Executive Director of Michigan Rising Action, Tori Sachs. So, Tori, that seems like misplaced priorities, doesn't it?
I think her priorities have been misplaced this entire pandemic, Kyle, and thanks so much for having me on. At the beginning of this pandemic, Whitmer spent the last day, essentially, one of the last days that Michigan was open, campaigning for Joe Biden. We know now that her health department thought COVID was in the state at that time, and they kept it open. They let Joe Biden come in here and campaign. That was back in March. And now here we are 9 months later, and there's still not a plan for our children to go back to school. And even the CDC says that, keeping kindergarten through 12th graders in school should be the top priority. And it seems like it hasn't been a priority at all for Michigan. And I think it's disappointing, but I'm not surprised because her priorities have been on politics this entire year.
So, what is Michigan Rising Action doing about it?
Well, Kyle, we've started a petition, and thousands of people have signed it recently, telling Governor Whitmer to forego her taxpayer-funded salary until she prioritizes putting children back in school and opening up our economy. And folks can sign that. We'd love to have you join us at MichiganRisingAction.org. Again, that's MichiganRisingAction.org to sign our petition. And it's really gaining steam. We saw business owners across the state start to call for Whitmer to forgo her salary until they can do business, until their workers can work, and until our children can go back to school.
And I know you talk to a lot of people around the state, as I do. There is so much frustration because there seems like there is such a disconnect in Lansing, particularly with the Democrats, but I think with some Republicans as well, that it's like they're completely disconnected from the real world. And so when you shut down restaurants, for example, it's not just a matter of keeping people away from each other, even though, as I said earlier, I was in a store recently, and you could see, just looking around the store from where I was standing, you could see 150 people, not socially distanced, and all of that, and yet you can't go to a restaurant. And so it just seems to me like there's such a disconnect that they don't realize, the people in Lansing, Robert Gordon and Gretchen Whitmer and everyone else in Lansing, they don't realize when you close restaurants, you're ending jobs, you're suspending jobs, you're hurting families. What do you think it's going to take for them to finally start listening to people?
I think people have to continue to speak up. People have to continue to call the governor's office, to call their state representative, to call their state senator, but mostly their governor's office, and let them know what's happening to these people. Every time Whitmer says, "I know what people are going through," no, she doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
She's getting $140,000 a year. She has a state paid house. All of these things that people don't have. We're now in the holiday season, and there's a lot of people. I worked at restaurants, for 10 years when I was starting my career, just on and off, and during college. And that's when we made our money, right? Was December, holiday parties, or people going out to dinner with their family because they don't want to cook before the holiday. And now you have a bunch of servers, cooks, hostesses, owners of restaurants who aren't going to be getting any money in December because of a state mandated shutdown. It's not fair. That's not the kind of country I thought we were living in.
Mm-hmm.
And it frankly needs to end. We saw the Supreme Court overturn her last executive orders, and I'm hoping we can see some sort of legal action that's fruitful in this endeavor as well.
Do you think that will happen? Because my perception of what happened was basically the court ruled those unconstitutional, but then the Health and Human Services Department just came right back with basically the same orders. And I know the Restaurant Association has fought them. Some private schools have fought them. But when do you think we will see any sort of legal recourse to those?
I mean, hopefully those cases keep moving, especially the schools case, as we get into January when schools will be open. The other thing I think that's not fair, and it's has been happening this entire pandemic, is Whitmer keeps, and as well as Gordon, they keep moving the goalpost,
Mm-hmm.
and they keep they're disingenuous, I think, with their orders as well, right? Because they did the 3-week pause most recently, and then they announced a 12-day extension. And at the press conference for the 12-day extension, Gordon, who is the MDHHS director, the guy who's making the orders now, who, by the way, is also advising the Biden transition for Health and Human Services. So it's lovely that Whitmer and Gordon both have time to be helping, Biden, one with his transition and then one with his inauguration while they're supposed to be fighting a pandemic. But then at that press conference announcing the 12-day extension, Gordon admitted, yeah, there's probably going to be businesses that have to be shut down past the 12 days. Well, if you keep moving the goalposts and you keep, people are trying to play by the rules. People understand that this virus is serious and that we need to do things to protect the people who are most at risk. But at the end of the day, they're not protecting the people most at risk, and they're moving the goalposts on everyone else, and they're being very disingenuous about what they're doing and why.
Well, and the way that they were viewing the extension, the 12-day extension, was that we need to see the impact of families getting together at Thanksgiving. Okay, so if that's how you're viewing it, then it's logical to think that there will be an extension beyond Christmas, because they'll want to see, how families were, not behaving during Christmas, and then the same thing with New Year's. And so it's very reasonable to see how these extensions and these lockdowns and shutdowns of restaurants and all of that, this could extend well into the new year. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Tori Sachs, give me one more time the website where people can go and sign the petition.
MichiganRisingAction.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, MI Rising Action.
Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. My colleague at Breitbart News, Joel Pollack, has a new ebook out this week titled Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 U.S. Presidential Election. He joins me now. So, Joel, if you can boil down the biggest thing that made the election neither free nor fair, what would it be?
Well, the obvious thing that happened was that the rules for the election were changed in the middle. We adopted a completely new voting system for many states called vote by mail. And it was adopted at the urging of Democrats and over the objections of Republicans. So that was by far the major factor. Once you allow large portions of the electorate to simply vote by mail, you're introducing huge levels of uncertainty and, unfortunately, possibilities of fraud. That doesn't mean fraud happened or happened to the extent necessary to change the outcome in the election. But we know from past examples and past warnings by Democrats and Republicans that absentee voting, vote by mail, is the most susceptible to fraud. It's a form of voting that requires additional safeguards. Democrats understood that right up through 2019. In fact, Democrat proposals for vote by mail in Congress specifically indicated that they would include robust signature matching as part of a way to guarantee there wouldn't be fraud. But in 2020, under the influence of Democratic Party lawyers like Mark Elias, the guy behind the Russia dossier, those safeguards were dropped. And so we saw the error rate or rejection rate of absentee ballots go way down, even as the number of absentee ballots or mail-in ballots went way up. You'd expect the opposite. You'd expect the percentages of rejected ballots to go up because many millions of people were doing it for the first time. Instead, we saw the percentages go way down. It is true that Democrats put a lot of energy into voter education, but it's also true that Democratic Party lawyers sued in many states to change the rules and lower the safeguards against fraud. They argued that these safeguards disenfranchised minority voters and were therefore racist. And so to insist that voters be able to prove who they are was considered a form of racism. So broadly, the biggest problem was the introduction of vote by mail at the behest of one party. But there were also other things I talk about in Neither Free Nor Fair that played a significant role. I talk about the problem of political violence, for example, the widespread rioting by the left, which was accompanied by this cancel culture. I mean, I just went to the grocery store yesterday and I noticed that Aunt Jemima had changed its label. You know, they dropped the African-American woman from the label, who apparently was quite a pioneering icon in her own day, the woman who's depicted or was depicted on the label.
Right.
They dropped Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima and other meaningless, or not meaningless, but harmless icons because of the fear that they were somehow racist. It's ridiculous. So there was this moral panic that was accompanied by the violence, or that accompanied the violence. And that had a huge effect on the election. It became impossible to advocate for Republicans, or for President Trump in particular, unless you were particularly courageous. A lot of people felt very intimidated. And there are many, many other things that happened in this election that were biased against the president, biased against Republicans. And it's remarkable that Trump and the Republicans did as well as they did with such a lopsided system.
So how does the Texas case against Michigan and Pennsylvania and the other states address what you're saying here, and specifically the vote by mail issue?
Well, what the Texas lawsuit says is that these 4 states went outside the state legislatures to make new rules. There were 2 ways that happened. One is through the courts. So Democratic lawyers brought these lawsuits and they got judgments in some of the courts, or they got these consent decrees, which are like settlement agreements enforced by the courts, where they convinced the state governments to change the laws. That happened in Georgia. There are also cases where Democratic Party officials just made executive decisions to change the rules of voting, or drop the rules, or not enforce the rules. So they made these decisions on their own that the state legislature had specifically declined to allow. And then there's a second argument, which is that the 4 states in question did not enforce or apply their voting rules and procedures uniformly across the states. And that gets to the influence of outside private money, Mark Zuckerberg and other sources, people who donated hundreds of millions of dollars to run what amounted to get out the vote operations through local governments in Democrat-heavy counties in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and so on. And the argument is that denied equal protection to voters in other counties, which were predominantly Republican. And the Gore versus Bush, or Bush versus Gore standard is that you can't have one standard for some counties and another standard for other counties. So they're arguing, Texas is arguing that in addition to the problems of going around the state legislature and changing the rules, these 4 states also applied the rules unevenly within their own boundaries.
So you take Michigan, for example, and if you have a Wayne County that is doing things a certain way, and you have a Kent County that's doing things a different way, and there is not the equal application of the law, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the law is applied fairly and equally? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the federal government? Whose role is that?
Well, that's a very good question. There's a role for both, really. We have secretaries of state, obviously, in different states, whose role it is to make sure the rules are applied evenly. But we also have some federal role in oversight. It's limited, but it is there in theory. And what we're talking about here is related to the other problem of making up rules as we go. So in Pennsylvania, for example, when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court changed the rules of the election, allowing people to submit ballots even if they were received after Election Day, up to 3 days after Election Day, that was allowed, I think, in Philadelphia. So the Philadelphia officials abided by that new Supreme Court ruling. But I think the Republican authorities in some of the other counties across the state, heavily Republican areas, they said, no, we're just going to go with state law on this. We're not going to obey this Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling because it seems constitutionally unsound to us. We're just going to be on the safe side and go with the state law. So you had different systems running in different places, partly because of the way that Democrats changed the rules. So that's the problem here. And there really is no recourse other than the federal court system for these problems. Texas is making a valid argument, which is that you're disenfranchising voters around the country if you change your own state's election rules in ways that are unconstitutional. Now, there's probably a limit to where the Supreme Court's going to want to go with that, because they don't want to create a precedent where states sue each other after elections. I mean, imagine if after 2016, California had sued Wisconsin, or something like that. I mean, you can imagine the bad incentives it creates if you say, we're going to have a vote and then we're going to let the states controlled by each party fight it out in court as to whether the vote was valid or not. So that's the risk in what Texas is doing. But Texas is raising a valid objection, which is we are all supposed to abide by the U.S. Constitution. These states didn't, and therefore the decision has to go back to the state legislatures, which are the place where these decisions are made under the Constitution.
So is that your prediction that this will ultimately be kicked back to the states and then the state legislatures will determine the electors?
I just think the Supreme Court, my prediction would be the Supreme Court will do that in at most one or two cases. I think, for example, in Georgia, the Supreme Court has a very good reason to send it back to the legislature because in that case, the state legislature did pass a law about ballot signatures in 2019, lowering the standards a little bit. And it was a bipartisan compromise after a very divisive 2018 campaign. So the two parties came together, they both agreed to change the rules in 2019. But then Democrats weren't satisfied with that, and they sued, and they pushed these other changes through a consent decree. And I think the court's going to look at something like that and say, wait, you can't do that. You can't go around the state legislatures, especially when the state legislature has shown you it's willing to act, it has acted. You can't just circumvent the state legislatures. We don't want that happening in federal elections that affect everybody. At the same time, I don't think they're necessarily going to go, for example, to Wisconsin. I'm just picking one example of a rule change in Wisconsin, but they're not going to say, hey, Wisconsin, you made a mistake because you allowed people to apply for absentee ballots without ID by claiming they were indefinitely confined. They're not indefinitely confined. Very few of those voters, I think there were like 100,000 of them, are actually indefinitely confined. It's just that the Secretary of State in Wisconsin or the state officials, county officials, whoever, allowed people to apply under that status. We don't like that. I don't think the court's going to actually do that. I think they're going to give broader discretion to state officials when they're making judgment calls in a pinch. I don't think the Supreme Court wants to question what might be good faith judgment calls by local officials when there isn't time necessarily to revisit a law or whatever. But I think where you can clearly show that there was a bipartisan effort in some of these states to make new laws that addressed some of the problems that Democrats later sued about. I think where the state legislatures could have acted, I think the court's going to say you really should have gone to the state legislature and not tried this end around, going around the legislatures, going around the voters.
Interesting. So where can listeners find Neither Free Nor Fair?
It's available exclusively right now on Amazon for Kindle, and you can read it if you have a computer. You don't need a Kindle device, but it's an ebook. It's doing very well. It's number one in both of its categories. So I encourage you to read it. People are really enjoying it. Neither Free Nor Fair is the name of the book.
Neither Free Nor Fair, the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Joel Pollack, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. I said on the show a couple weeks ago, our elected leaders are making Thanksgiving and Christmas times more difficult this year. Times that many families look forward to and that give us hope. Instead, I believe we're being conditioned to fear them and wonder if our family members are going to make us sick. Reverend Dr. Samuel Rodriguez is president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, and he has a new book out titled From Survive to Thrive. So, Pastor, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So your book is an honest look at the pain millions of people are experiencing during the coronavirus pandemic and offers 7 words to find hope and overcome the challenges we face in life. So tell me about those.
Indeed. Live a holy, healed, healthy, happy, humble, hungry, honoring life. And I'll repeat that. Live a holy, healed, healthy, happy, humble, hungry, honoring life. I call them the 7 H's. This really serves as a biblically substantiated prescription for us to go beyond perpetual survival mode. I so agree with you with the premise of your initial comments. There is an attempt, be it deliberate or not, be it intentional or not, we don't know. But we do see, without a doubt, an attempt to place a permanent lid. This idea that we will forevermore live in the wilderness or in the desert of survival or even victimization, where fear is the lid. I see every single human being in America and around the world, for that matter, will fall into one of the 3 respective categories. Every human being is either failing, surviving, or thriving. If I were to engage a biblical narrative as a metaphor, Every single person is either in Egypt, the desert, or the promised land. And right now, it seems like all of us are right now just going around in circles in that desert of life because of COVID, social unrest, political discord, and so forth. And it looks like we're never, ever going to enter into a land of promise, of thriving. This book provides that biblically substantiated prescription on how to get you from survival to thriving.
So you've got 10 chapters in your book, From Survive to Thrive. Chapter 3, Healed by Faith. Explain that.
We all need to be healed. Broken people break people. Bleeding people, people that are wounded, bleed on others. But when you are healed, you can literally change the world. That's not cliche. It's factual. We can change the world. We all go through journeys, all of us. In the midst of our journeys, we go through struggles. We go through moments of, here it is, unbelief, doubt, skepticism. Even those involved in faith, there are questions that we have, queries that emerge out of our personal life narratives. In the midst of it all, we can't deny the fact that the same God of the process is the God of the outcome. We can't conflate our temporary with our permanent, which means your now is not your next. But we have to have the cognitive bandwidth, the spiritual maturity, the openness that there is a sovereign, mighty God who has a purpose and a destiny for each and every one of us. And if we live according to his word, his will, and in his way, meaning him being the way, we can't just survive, we thrive. So we must be healed, not just physically. I'm not talking about physical healing exclusively, mental, emotional, relational, issues from our past, our family, and so forth. Healing is the conduit, is the bridge that enables us to go from survival mode to thriving mode. And when you're healed, even the way you pray changes. You go from Lord bless me to Lord make me a blessing. You go from Lord answer my prayer to God make me the answer to someone else's prayer.
So how, if someone is in survival mode or they're in the wilderness, how do they begin that process?
And by the way, being in the wilderness is not a sin. We all must go through the wilderness. Even Jesus himself went through his wilderness experience prior to the full launching of a 3.5-year ministry that literally changed the world. We all go through the wilderness. It's not going through the wilderness, it's staying in the wilderness. In no moment in scripture, in the Old Testament, did anyone ever build an altar in the desert. The Israelites never built one altar, one memorial in the desert, because it's something that you go through to get to. How do you do it? By first recognizing the fact that there is a survival mode, by realizing that you're not made for the desert, that you're made for greater things. John 10:10, the latter part. You are made for greater things. By understanding that life places lids on us. There is a lid. There is a lid of lies. I write in the book about the truth about lies. And I outline a number of lies regarding definition, identity, purpose, that we somehow embrace. And we have to remove and recognize the lids. The moment we become dependent, and by dependent, I don't mean on God or on giftings and abilities. Sometimes we're dependent on the manna and the water coming out of the rock. I'm speaking metaphorically now, but listen, we're not suffering from malnourishment, right? Because we're getting manna and we're getting water from a rock, but it doesn't compare to milk and honey in the promised land. So we have to recognize, we have to ask ourselves, it begins with, am I surviving or thriving? Am I surviving or am I thriving? Am I just making it or am I living life abundantly? And these are the questions that will prompt us to ask the Lord to intervene. And that's where that faith element kicks in. Jesus come in, whatever in my life is out of alignment that places me in perpetual survival mode, please address it. One of these issues is a victimization mentality. When you believe that you are an eternal victim, and even in America, that's the question right now. We have sectors of our society that hear repeatedly through mass media and political leaders that they are victims. In perpetuity, they are victims. They were victims 200 years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago. They forevermore will be victims. That is antithetical to the will of God. We can't be both victims and more than conquerors. And that's what the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 8:37. So if you are a permanent victim, you're in survival mode. The moment you realize that you were a victim, but you are no longer a victim, you enter into a thriving lifestyle.
But what, this is all very personal. But what if you're in a situation where you refuse to be a victim, but you still feel like you're in that wilderness?
This is where resilience and faith truly kick in. This is where we do what I call the 2 Chronicles 20 verse 12 moment, where we have a king named Jehoshaphat, who found himself in that same identical predicament and said, look, God, I don't want to be a victim, but I am in the hardest chapter of my life. And these are the words that came out of his mouth. I have no idea what to do next. Verbatim. He said, I have no idea what to do. That crying out to God, sometimes that's all we have. We lose our relationships. We lose our sanity. We lose our resources. All we have is the ability to say, God, I have no idea what to do next. That is not a moment of weakness. That may very well be the quintessential example of strength. The recognition that you have no idea what to do next. The Bible says that God intervened, sent a prophet who told this man, don't worry, the battle is mine, saith the Lord, I got this. All because he cried out. It's our ability to cry out that removes the lid of perpetual surviving and catapults us to thriving. I don't care if you get into thriving mode with a limp, as long as you cry out unto God, that's where he elevates you to a place beyond your current wilderness and places you under the shadow of his wing, where you become a blessing, and your testimony will actually heal others that may be going through the wilderness.
Chapter 9 is alive to thrive, refuse to settle for less than God's best. What is God's best?
God's best is for you to live that holy, healed, healthy, happy, humble, hungry, honoring life. It really is. God's best is for you to become a blessing to everyone you know. God's best is for you to be light in the midst of darkness. God's best is for you to communicate with him as a friend. These are all biblically substantiated, biblical verses for each of these. God's best is for you to walk like you are seated with Christ, Ephesians 2:6, already in heavenly places, which means through Christ, you have a place of authority. God's best is for you not just to have life, but for you to have eternal life, John 3:16, abundant life, John 10:10, and new life, 2 Corinthians 5:17. That's God's best. God's best is for your children to walk upon the ruins of what you bring down in your generation. God's best is for your children not to inherit your sins, but for your children to inherit your blessings. That's God's best. And it arrives via the conduit of the 7 H's. One of them is humility. Gratitude feeds humility, requiring us to wake up every morning, and instead of looking at what we don't have or no longer have or what we have lost, and we have all experienced losses, all of us, even in this COVID-19 pandemic and even prior, we all experience a time of grief and pain and consternation and angst. But waking up in the morning with the spirit of, even though I have lost some things in life and some of them are painful, let me focus on what I still have. I have a faith that moves mountains. I have a shout, speaking metaphorically, that brings down walls. I have the ability to cry out. I have the ability to pray and communicate with heaven. I have the ability to look around nature and the universe and admire and take in the very creative presence and power of a mighty God who is a God of order, even in the midst of a chaotic world. So focus on what you have. Give thanks for what you do have, and don't focus on what's missing in your life.
Reverend Dr. Samuel Rodriguez is president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, and he has a new book titled From Survive to Thrive. Pastor, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Many blessings, my friend.
Thank you. This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. One of my concerns about the seeming slowness of the John Durham investigation into who was involved in the Russia hoax is that you can guarantee John Durham would be the very first person Joe Biden fires if he actually becomes president. So apparently, to combat that, Attorney General William Barr appointed him as a special prosecutor. My next guest says the same thing needs to happen in the case of Hunter Biden and the Biden family's apparent exploitation of the vice presidency. Colorado Congressman Ken Buck, a former district attorney, joins me now. So, Congressman, why do you want the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor?
I think the special prosecutor has certain protections from the regular political change that occurs in administrations. And the special counsel has authority to investigate and is given independent resources. And I think in this case, the subject matter is absolutely significant and important for the American people to get to the bottom of. It's actually impeachable conduct if the vice president at the time knew that his son was selling his authority and access and benefiting financially from it. And so I think it is a very important issue. It's an issue that's going to cloud the Biden presidency if, in fact, Joe Biden is formally sworn in as president. And I think that in order for America to move forward, it just makes sense to clear up this matter.
So lay out the case how the Biden family business ventures impact both a potential Biden presidency and, maybe more importantly, national security.
Well, what can be done in terms of Ukraine or even the region that has credibility when the vice president's son has received a board appointment and made over $500,000 as a result of being the vice president's son? And I don't think it's just an allegation. I think it's quite clear that all of those things happened. The allegation, it really is whether the vice president knew about it, consented to it, and participated in it. And if he did, as I said, I think it's an impeachable offense. And I think that the only way for America to move forward in that region is to make sure that the world knows, and certainly the American voters and taxpayer know, that we are not selling access to a government official in the international market.
Based on what you've seen, do you believe it's an impeachable offense?
Oh, it is certainly an impeachable offense. I don't know that the evidence has been presented yet as to Joe Biden's involvement in these activities. It would make sense that he knew. It would make sense that companies don't throw $500,000 around lightly, and that they got some benefit from the access that they had with the vice president's son. But the real question, and it just is going to take an investigation, and that's why I'm calling for a special counsel. The real question is, what, if anything, did the vice president know when his son was out peddling his father's name?
Joe Biden said recently that his family would not do any business that would even create the appearance of a conflict of interest. But all of this happened, what you're talking about, happened when he was vice president. Why should we believe him now based on what we know his family was doing the last time he was in office?
Well, it's not just that. I think that's a big part of it. But I think when you look at Joe Biden's career, his 47-year career in government, and he had to withdraw from a presidential race because he had plagiarized material from other candidates. When he has been vice president of the United States and brags about how he shut down a special prosecutor in the Ukraine and his son received $500,000, I think the questions are so significant, and his activity is so consistent that the American people have reason to question the Biden family moving forward.
Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff once called for legislation to protect then Special Counsel Robert Mueller, but now says AG Barr's appointment of John Durham is to continue a, quote, politically motivated investigation. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think Adam Schiff should know what politically motivated investigations are all about. He obviously conducted one with the impeachment hearings from beginning to end. He set that up, and really the damage that has done to this country is immeasurable, and it's really sad that he was pushing that, and so the inconsistencies in Mr. Schiff's statements aren't surprising to me. I think that he will do anything he can to take down a Republican administration and be popular with a very liberal base that he has in California, regardless of the Constitution, and at the same time is going to protect a Democrat at all costs. And the appointment by Bill Barr, I think, made a lot of sense. Let's get to the bottom of what happened. If a federal government investigating agency, and especially the premier investigating agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, conducted an investigation of a presidential campaign based on political appointees in the administration asking for that to happen, and based on false information that was presented to the FISA court. That is certainly something that the American public wants to know and should know, and this investigation should continue.
Looking forward to next year in the new Congress, it appears that the Democrats will have a significantly smaller majority. How do you think that is going to play out? What do you think the focus of the House will be? What will the agenda of the Republicans be in the new Congress?
Well, let's unpack a few of those questions one at a time, really. I think what's so fascinating is that Speaker Pelosi has a real issue on her hands. She has a very, very far left wing of her party that is pushing for radical change. And even though the voters rejected that radical change at the polls in November, the speaker is caught between trying to win elections and those radicals. And she can't turn her back on those radicals or try to minimize them, because that's the difference in the vote to make her speaker, number one, but also to try to hold on to the majority. And so she is in a really difficult rock and a hard place situation. I think that the reality is that the Republicans will have much more to say, and I say Republican leadership will have much more to say in the outcome of legislation than in the past. And so there's a possibility that some positive bipartisan legislation can be accomplished on issues like reining in the power of big tech and making sure that pharmaceuticals are being sold at the lowest possible price to Americans, and many issues that Americans care deeply about. But at the same time, Speaker Pelosi doesn't have enough of a majority to really compromise on some of those important areas.
Do you think that the presidential race will ultimately end up in the Supreme Court? And do you think that the House of Representatives will be playing a role in who is the next president?
As to the first question, I think the Supreme Court will have a role. Whether they accept the full role of holding hearings and issuing opinions, I'm not sure. The state of Texas just filed a case yesterday, late in the afternoon, evening, and that will be heard by the Supreme Court. And also the Pennsylvania case may come to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court will have a role. The likelihood that the House will be involved in a determination of who the next president is, I think that is less likely than the Supreme Court issuing an opinion on this. And I think, frankly, it's pretty clear to me that there was serious fraud. Whether the extent of the fraud would have reversed the election in Pennsylvania or Michigan or some of these other states, I don't know. But to deny the fraud is a mistake, because we undermine Americans' confidence in an election. And I feel very strongly that we should be pursuing all avenues to investigate this fraud and really be as transparent as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. Colorado Congressman Ken Buck, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. For more of my work, go to Breitbart.com or find me on Parler, Kyle Olson 4. Kyle Olson 4, KYLEOLSON, and the number 4. This is The Kyle Olson Show.